Welcome to the Voices of War, a podcast with a simple vision to bring to life the true costs of war through the voices of those who've lived it. I'm your host Maz, and I hope you enjoy this episode. My guest today is Michael Vatikiotis, who is a writer, journalist, and private diplomat working in Southeast Asia since 1987. He was formerly editor of the Far Eastern Economic Review, as well as a journalist in Asia for more than 3 decades. He currently lives in Singapore and is the Asia director of the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue, a Geneva-based private foundation that facilitates dialogue to resolve armed conflicts. Michael has written 2 novels set in Indonesia and 3 books on the politics of Southeast Asia, including Blood and Silk, Power and Conflict in Modern Southeast Asia, which we'll focus on a lot today, as well as Political Change in Southeast Asia, Trimming the Banyan Tree. His latest book, Lives Between the Lines, A Journey in Search of the Lost Levant, was published in August this year. In addition to his books, Michael regularly writes opinion pieces for international and regional newspapers and is a regular contributor to outlets such as Al Jazeera and the BBC. Michael is a graduate of the School of Oriental and African Studies in London and gained his doctorate from the University of Oxford. He joins me today to discuss the social, political and cultural dynamics of Southeast Asia and the role it plays, or is likely to play, in the complex world of modern geopolitics. Michael, it is a pleasure to host you on the Voices of War. Thank you for joining me.
Good to be here, Maz.
So maybe before we get into the complex and dense topic of Southeast Asia, maybe you can start with a little bit about your own background. What took you to that part of the world, and perhaps more importantly, what made you stay?
Well, it's an interesting little story in that it was accidental to some extent. I was actually following in my father's footsteps, studying the Middle East, Islamic history, and interested in the Middle East itself, which is where my family comes from. We are sort of Italians and Greeks from Egypt and Palestine. And I was at the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London, and I asked if I could do a degree where part of the time I learned Arabic and part of the time I did Middle Eastern history and political science. And they said no. The Arabic department basically said, no, unless you do Arabic full time, there's absolutely no way that, we'll let you do the language. And so accidentally, I mean, in the coffee shop, literally, I ran into someone who was teaching modern Southeast Asian languages and said, well, we'll let you do Thai and Indonesian part-time, and it was literally on the basis of that I started to focus on Southeast Asia and grew to be fascinated by the region, particularly its sort of post-colonial history. I ended up learning Thai and Indonesian, and I ended up doing a PhD on Thailand, spending 2 years or so in northern Thailand studying the dynamics of the city of Chiang Mai. And then again, accidentally, I was headed into academia, and I had a job at the University of Hong Kong lined up after my PhD. And it was my mother who persuaded me to apply for a job at the BBC, perhaps because she didn't want me to leave the country. And so I ended up working for the BBC World Service, and they sent me first to Southeast Asia as a correspondent in Indonesia, and then I stayed.
So contrary to your mother's ultimate wishes, as it would seem.
Yeah, I stayed in Indonesia, and I eventually left the BBC after about 2 years and joined the former glorious Far Eastern Economic Review as its correspondent in Indonesia, and then moved around the region. I was posted in Malaysia, in Thailand as bureau chief, and then I went to Hong Kong as deputy editor and eventually editor. And so, it was 16 years at the Far Eastern Economic Review. Great career, a great induction into reporting Southeast Asia and understanding the region, and working with some tremendous colleagues.
Yeah, and having just recently finished Blood and Silk, which I found an absolutely fascinating read. It's very obvious how nuanced your understanding of the region is, and it's a book I highly recommend to all my listeners for that very reason. So there was one particular point of the book that maybe is a good place to set us off onto this journey of understanding Southeast Asia, and that is you described democracy in Southeast Asia as a delusion. And maybe that's an interesting place for us to launch from, because I think it will open up a number of avenues or interesting avenues for us to explore. What did you mean by that? Why is democracy a delusion in Southeast Asia?
Well, I think that, all the time that I've studied and reported from the region, there's been this perpetual struggle for establishing representative participatory government. The region, when it was immediately after the colonial era, many of these states were re-established or established. Indonesia was a completely modern state. The Burma emerged from the colonial context. Thailand was never colonized. Malaysia was given independence in 1957, incidentally, the year of my birth. All these countries were established in the mold of modern nation states with some form, whether it was in the case of Malaysia, a sort of directly imported Westminster-style parliament. In the case of Indonesia, it was a sort of prime minister plus president cabinet-led system with a sort of sprawling, series of interlocking national assemblies. But very quickly, within about 10 years or less, these forms of participatory representative government either collapsed or were subverted by military takeovers, by internal disunity and fractiousness. And then the rest has been a long struggle, essentially, to reestablish or reassert the sovereignty of people. And it's been a long and perpetual struggle. And that's why I say, in many ways, the sort of purer form of democracy that many people would like to see exercised in Southeast Asia is somewhat delusional. You take the Philippines, for example, which was established after the American Commonwealth, very much as a sort of carbon copy of the American bicameral system with a president, an elected president. And by the 1970s, there was martial law. Then there was a sort of period of people's power in the mid-1980s where an elected presidency and democracy was restored. But very quickly after that, there were further efforts at a military takeover. And of course, since then, every single president with with almost no exception after the end of their mandatory 6-year term has been prosecuted and jailed. And so it's a very, perhaps delusional is too strong a word, but I think it's very problematic across Southeast Asia to think that it's possible to see a smoothly functioning democratic system. The one exception, and I think we're all going to be surprised in the end by Indonesia. I'm not particularly surprised. I think Indonesia is the one country in the region that was an invention of itself, and it was such an important invention that they arrived at independence having had a struggle against the colonial Dutch, having won that, having fought with blood, sweat, and tears for their independence and their freedom, having created a nation in the mold of a modern nation, not an ancient kingdom, but a modern nation based on ideals, very much distilled from the sort of, the left-wing politics of Europe in the sort of pre-war period, and a constitution that in its economy and in its idealism is almost unmatched in the region. It took a long time, but after 1998, with the removal of an autocratic leader and sort of semi-military rule, Indonesia essentially established itself as a robust, representative, participatory democracy. And it has remained the same. Yes, there's a lot of carping today about the shortcomings of Indonesia's democratic system. But the fact is that people get to vote for the president every 5 years, that there is a peaceful transfer of power, at least so far. And the country is largely free and people are treated fairly.
So what is it then about, well, with the exception of Indonesia, then about the rest of Southeast Asia? Why wasn't it as successful in bringing through the ideas of democracy as, ultimately the West would have liked, or as the West perceives democracy?
I think in Blood and Silk, I point out that the two, if you like, generalizations that I make about the region, and of course they're not perfect. One is the weakness of institutions. And two, related to that to some extent, is of course the privileged elites that have run these countries, controlled or run or remained at the apex of political and social systems, for the last 70 years. And those privileged elites stand in the way of a more robust participatory system with full popular sovereignty.
Yeah, and that's certainly an aspect I'd really like to explore, because when I was reading that part of the book, particularly about the elites, it resonated so strongly with me because it echoes of what I've come to know of the Balkans and the control and manipulation by those elites to remain in power by using ethnicity, religion, and so on. What do you mean by elites for those who firstly aren't necessarily familiar with the idea of elite capture or elites maintaining control? What do we mean by that in the Southeast Asian context?
Well, it's a combination of two things. It's to some extent the privileged elites that emerged from the colonial era, to some extent, who were educated or who were given preferential treatment in the colonial context. Also, the business elites tends to be large conglomerates that want to preserve semi-monopolies. And military elites. Yeah. The military, as you know, creates a very hierarchical system. And in the Southeast Asian context, has been rather privileged, even though it's a part of the world that hasn't fought very many wars, certainly not among themselves. The military serves a rather sort of internal security function for the most part in many of these countries. And it's created an element of privilege. They want to preserve budgets. They want to preserve a sort of a way of life, a leadership that can't be touched or scrutinized. And so the establishment of these elites, these three pillars, the sort of highly educated, often aristocratic, the business elites, often sort of overseas Chinese conglomerates, and then the military security elites, who want to remain untouched and unscrutinized in order to preserve their power. I mean, these are essentially the three pillars that have kept some of the normal functioning institutions of a well-balanced democratic system, i.e., anti-corruption, frequent regular changes of office holders, transfer of power. It's been very difficult to maintain those things in the face of this elite privilege and resistance.
And you make that quite clear in the book. And one of the things that also strikes me is that a sense of identity is being manipulated by these elites, and also the idea of nationhood, or what we would consider as nationhood, is perhaps a secondary order need for many of the social groups around Southeast Asia. Did I read that accurately? That there are other identities that are far more important, whether cultural, religious, ethnic identities, that surpass this idea of nationhood, or standing behind a flag. Did I read that accurately in your book?
Well, the whole question of identity in Southeast Asia, I think, there are good and bad aspects. So the good aspect, of course, is it's extremely fluid. You have 630 or more million people in Southeast Asia, divided between the mainland and the islands, a huge amount of diversity, overlain by sort of historical patterns of migration. And so there isn't a lot of uniformity or homogeneity in Southeast Asia. Even in countries like Thailand, which prides itself as being a sort of unitary kingdom, there is much more diversity than meets the eye. And the mainland states and the island states were always a sort of checkerboard of little principalities, bounded by hills and valleys, or as islands that developed more or less on their own, with their own forms of leadership and cultures and languages, over many centuries. And they were sort of unified here and there over time, not always very successfully or for very long. In the post-colonial context, of course, these old historical kingdoms were reinvented in the case of Burma. In the case of the 9 states of Malaysia, there was a federal system put in place. In the case of Indonesia, a unitary state that sort of rather improbably amalgamated all these different islands and regions and languages. But the great secret in Indonesia, in terms of their identity, was the use of a common language. Bahasa,
which was created, right? Bahasa was literally created for that purpose, correct?
It was a form of Malay. It's basically a standard Malay that was spoken in parts of Sumatra, but not in Java, for instance. It was a trade. I mean, Malay is a trading language, and so it was the easiest and most convenient to use because everyone spoke a bit of it, because that's how people traded. Today, of course, what's ironic in Southeast Asia is that the major common language across the region is English. The common language of commercial exchange is neither Chinese nor Malay or any of the other languages. It's English. But this question of identity, the very positive aspect of it was that, there was, because of the need to sort of bind these groups of people together, there was never any sense of enforced assimilation or integration. In the European context, for a couple of hundred years, the whole notion of a nation state involved a single identity for the most part. And that often led to religious and ethnic discrimination, as you know from the European context. In the Southeast Asian context, most of the constitutions of independence allowed for pluralism, tolerated religious difference, mandated that people could have whatever faith they wanted, and could sort of speak their own language and even to go to their own schools if need be. And I think that's always been a positive. It's created a lot less conflict than we've seen in other parts of the world where nationalism imposed a single identity or a single faith. Indonesia has long argued over this, of course. There are those in Indonesia who would still like to see it as an Islamic state. I don't think it will ever happen. I think pluralism is a bedrock. So I think the identity is not that. To some, the multiple identities of the region have served it well and have prevented and reduced levels of conflict over time, even where there has been anti-Chinese sentiment, where there have been sort of pogroms here and there against Muslims by Buddhists and against Christians and so on. But by and large, the record is a good one. And up till very recently, I had been rather worried by the emergence of, if you like, identity politics, as you alluded to earlier. And when I wrote the book, I was extremely worried about this. I'm slightly more encouraged today because as the wave of extremism has passed, and as sensible people in all these countries recognize that actually what holds them together is diversity, and not polarization. The polarization is still there and it's still exploited. And of course, one of the ironies of democratization is that it actually allows people in plural politics to play identity politics. But, I think even with that sort of threat, I think that pluralism wins out across Southeast Asia for the most part.
Right. So almost ironically, the lack of credible democracy, as we would consider democracy, has allowed for this pluralist ideals to permeate and remain, which I guess is very much historically tied to the region, right? As you rightly point out, there's very little local conflict, across Southeast Asia, again, comparative to the rest of the world. So having been there for so long, what, in your view, does the Anglo-West not understand about Southeast Asia?
I think two things today. I think one, of course, is that there's an underappreciation of the extent to which this sort of malleability and flexibility around identity and around political systems, the whole ambiguity of norms and values which frustrates a lot of Westerners because they want rules, they want the rule of law, they want a set of institutions that govern things in a certain way. But
clean
of course,
and neat,
But this is what holds the region together because it prevents conflict. And I think that there is still that that sense, and it's maybe getting worse because as the geopolitics becomes more polarized, there is, if you like, a more urgent demand on the part, particularly of the sort of the Western powers, the United States and Europe, that Southeast Asia somehow kind of hews to a model that is somehow similar to theirs, because in a way, this is less about what they think about institutions and norms and values, and more about trying to retain a sense of primacy. And so somehow Southeast Asia should look more like us, because in the great contest with China, we certainly don't want them to be ending up in that camp. And so this I think is going to get a lot worse. This mismatch between in terms of values, in terms of a misunderstanding or a misperception of how this region ticks, its whole sort of flexibility and adaptability to different conditions can frustrate people who are looking for alignments and alliances and looking for rather sort of hard boundaries between them and us. I mean, Southeast Asia's, you look at where it is in the world, it's between larger countries, between great seas. It is essentially a locus of trade and exchange. It's always been a great place for movement of people in and through and out. And I think that to try and lock Southeast Asia into some kind of, idée fixe about ideology and norms and values is I think going to make people feel very uncomfortable here, and they will reject that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess as someone who is deeply embedded in the idea of diplomacy and dialogue, I guess you're very well positioned to make that assessment. And my question from that is then, how do we build those bridges then? Because you strike me as though you're someone who walks in two worlds. You are so deeply embedded in Southeast Asia, linguistically, with speaking two of the principal languages. But of course, you're educated in the West. Whilst you have diverse roots, you grew up, I think, by and large, in the kind of Western system. So you really understand the West. So how do we build those bridges then? Because as you alluded to, in the ongoing contestation between US and China, Southeast Asia stands to play a very powerful role, perhaps. So how do we get to that point?
Well, I think it's really going to be hard because the Southeast Asian position is they don't want to align or choose. There is, of course, a great deal of concern about the way China has been behaving as it rose, as it's risen, as it's become, for the first time in its history, a great power with the need for an external interaction. I mean, if you look at previous periods of Chinese history, they were always big and powerful and they demanded tribute, but they didn't really sort of interfere very much. I mean, they kept themselves to themselves, and with very few exceptions, it was a very insular, inward-looking empire. The great fear in Southeast Asia is that may change, and that China, because of its needs as the world's largest economy, increasingly, is going to be like every other empire in the world. The need for resources, the need for control of those resources, the need to use power and force to control, the availability of those resources and trading routes, which then leads to a very, very different kind of China than anything that the region has been used to dealing with in the past. And so there is a great sort of sense of concern about that. And to some, it seems that the best way to deal with that is to sort of balance it with a strategic sort of investment in closer ties with the US and the Western powers. And that's, kind of the bedrock assumption, I think, that that they want to sort of try and swing it both ways. Where I sit in Singapore, the Singaporeans have invested heavily in the Sinosphere in terms of trade, investment, money, capital. Capital and people. But at the same time, they're very worried if you invest everything in that Sinosphere. How are you going to counterbalance that? How are you going to avoid being captured by the Sinosphere? And so it's a great conundrum. I don't think at the same time that it's a very good time for Southeast Asia to be thinking about these things in a coherent way, because at the same time as the geopolitics impinges on the region is not very well connected, is not very well networked. I mean, there's the fact that the pandemic, of course, over the last 2 years has prevented effective face-to-face diplomacy within the region. And then secondarily, I think it's also the fact that most of the leaders in Southeast Asia, again, one of the ironies of more frequent changes of government with more liberal political systems is that leaders don't really know each other the way that they did 30 years ago. They're not well connected. They've got very little in common with one another. And again, because of the region's peculiar because of its peculiar diversity, the Thais have very little in common with the Malaysians. Malaysians, even though there's a common sort of language, have very little in common with the Javanese and much of Indonesia. And so it's very, very hard to maintain, especially at a time like this, effective interaction and communication on critical issues. And this is made for very poor regional diplomacy at a time when the 10 nations of Southeast Asia should be acting in concert to deal with this massive challenge of geopolitical bipolarity.
Yeah, and I guess here you're probably referring to ASEAN and its potential, but also its difficulties and kind of a consensus-driven, kind of long-standing debate-based organization. Am I reading between the lines there?
Yeah, ASEAN has become, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations has become a very popular punch bag at the moment, particularly in the light of what's been happening in Myanmar post the military coup. But it's never really been set up as a strong, coordinated, sovereignty softening body. It was always essentially meant as a convenience. It was designed as a convenience, largely to prevent interstate conflict in the region, which it has done very effectively, but not really to promote intervention or to promote regional governance or to promote common values. I mean, they don't have common values, really. And so
that's interesting. Sorry to jump in. That's a really interesting point. They don't have common values. How would you describe that? That strikes me as a very important point.
Well, Indonesia is the most modern state in the region. It has a very republican mindset. Thailand is a traditional monarchy. The mainland states share some sort of cultural similarities. You could argue for cultural similarities across the region. Everyone grows rice. Everyone had a sort of background of spirit worship. There are the great religions, Buddhism, Islam, and Christianity. There are those sort of commonalities. But in terms of what people actually have in common, they've largely lived rather isolated from each other. Let's face it, budget air travel is less than 20 years old in this region. The fact that people are able to get on a plane in Penang and go to Bangkok, is a very recent phenomenon. Ordinary people, not the elites.
Of course.
I have just booked a flight from Singapore to Bangkok for less than $400, which is an affordable price for middle-class people. I think that that's something that had been beginning to change, at least before the pandemic, the sort of sense of people understanding each other a little better. But there's a long way to go. Borders, there are lots of hard boundaries, and sovereignty is still a very, very important issue in this part of the world.
Yeah. And I was just going to say that then also, I guess, relates to the point you made about the elite capture and the sovereignty idea, and how that the elites, it's in their interest to retain sovereignty over their own domains, however far and wide they reach, which is, of course, then why an organization like ASEAN, is not likely to be seen by those very elites as a useful tool, because it might dilute that very control and power they hold. But from this then, and coming back to China, because you mentioned about the kind of aggressive nature of Chinese intervention, and you certainly talk about that in the book, does that not lend itself for exploitation then? Because, we turned broadly as kind of wolf warrior diplomacy and isolating individual nations or groups for negotiations. China has an absolute asymmetry of power in those dealings. Do you see that having an impact in the region?
Well, no one wants a war. As I said just now, I mean, the 10 nations of Southeast Asia have successfully over the last half century avoided interstate conflict. That's not to say they've avoided intrastate or internal conflict. There's more or less been perpetual intrastate or internal conflict since independence in many countries. But, largely they've avoided sort of interstate warfare. And China, I think, is also of the view that war is not the best way for it to implement, its interests in the region and beyond. The problem is that the United States and its allies essentially are steeped in the culture of alliance and alignment, and in a way, a history of successful prosecution of war. Whether it was the victory in 2 world wars, by the UK and the US and some of the European powers, or as some would see it, this, and of course this is debatable in the last 30 years, the successful establishment of a model of limited warfare. Now, of course, that's a more controversial issue, because in the Middle East, as we've seen, the US can maybe claim that it achieved its objectives in Iraq and Kuwait before that, but of course the civilian costs was enormous. And I think that my concern now is that there is a sense in Washington and possibly even some European countries that limited war is actually a viable tool of shoring up primacy. I think in this part of the world, there is this great aversion to war and suffering, because, of course, they've recently experienced it. I mean, the Indochina wars of the 1960s and 70s, plus the anti-communist struggles that sort of engulfed the region, cost the lives of more than 12 million people, and that's in living memory. And so I think there's an aversion to war, and there's a desire to accommodate. I mean, if you take the South China Sea, for instance, which many US, European, and Australian commentators find it hard to believe that Southeast Asian states are willing to accept China's imposition of sovereignty, over the South China Sea. A more reasonable assumption in Southeast Asia is that, look, this is China's only maritime front. We can expect them to want to dominate it. We have to find ways of adjusting to that. There isn't a legal fix to the sovereignty disputes. We're just going to have to manage. And managing conflict has always been, I think, the sort of Southeast Asian way. You're never going to resolve, you're never going to end, you're never going to sort of end in some sort of agreement, but you will always find a way to manage with the least harm and the least, if you like, violent fallout that suits everybody, but somehow never really results in any resolution.
You make the point in the book that Southeast Asia is kind of a nut, in between the two arms of a giant nutcracker, and that being China and the US. So, but what I'm hearing you say now, it strikes me as though it's actually the rigidity and the lack of nuance and understanding of the region from the West that's actually pouring more fuel onto the fire. It's putting more pressure onto Southeast Asia than Southeast Asia would like. And incidentally, it's then therefore putting more pressure onto China, and it's, an action, reaction. Is that accurate?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
I take the view, and it's, of course, not everyone would agree with this, that I think China was always going to run into obstacles when it realized that it could no longer adhere to this sort of fanciful 5 principles of peaceful coexistence, non-interference, and so on, because the logic of its growth and expansion as an economy, as a global economy, means that it was always going to have to deal with the outside world in a way that was different from its historical memory. And they're going to have to get entangled in regional conflicts. They're going to have to take a stand on, for instance, Afghanistan, on developments in Central Asia. They got involved in the ethnic peace process in Myanmar. This was inevitable. And they don't really have a good way of dealing with that. They're not used to it. They're not the best diplomats, and they can be clumsy. They can come in and bang the table. The whole culture in China of officials having to make sure that instructions are followed leads to a great deal of rigidity and I think ineffectiveness. However, as you say, I think on the other side of the ledger, there is now this enormous pressure on this region to take sides, to align, and this whole language of alliance and alignment. If you read every single American statement about Southeast Asia, it's shared values, which is actually not true, and strategic, alliances and relationships, which imply a them and us. It's not a collective whole. It's like you're with us and not with them, and that just sets up a great deal of not just discomfort, but I think friction that makes people feel very uncomfortable in this part of the world. They simply have to live with China as they have to live to some extent with India. Now, it's fortunate for this region that India, which is also an emerging power, has very little interest in the outside world. India is interested in its own region, doesn't really have much of a forward policy. And so to some extent, that's relieved the pressure on this region from having those 2 giant neighbors. But on the other hand, China has been provoked now, and it feels that it has to make these stands. It has to fly its fighter aircraft close to Taiwan. It has to match the more or less perpetual presence now of the US Navy in the South China Sea. And at the same time, the US is putting pressure on Europe and Australia and its allies to sort of to join this confrontation. It's very provocative. I think it's fair to say that the presentation of freedom of navigation operations as something that the US does everywhere in order to maintain the freedom of the sea lanes is not really a true assessment of what they're actually doing. What they're actually doing is sort of coming up against the Chinese Navy in the South China Sea to sort of, in a very sort of meaningful, strategic way. They are obviously at the operator level want to avoid, mishaps and miscalculation, but the room for that has definitely grown.
And it strikes me again that this kind of action reaction idea, which is what we're kind of describing here as well, is that can lead us down some very dangerous waters. No pun intended in this case, but it certainly can lead to accidents, misjudgments, miscalculations. And given the nature of your work, how worried are leaders across Southeast Asia about this? And what do they actually want for their region?
They're very worried, but there's also an air of resignation. I was talking to a senior Southeast Asian diplomat the other day about this sort of proposed code of conduct in the South China Sea. And, he said, look, if it was difficult before because the Chinese weren't really being sincere about developing a binding code of conduct, it's now even more difficult because everything's become colored by the sort of the US-China confrontation. So I think there's frustration, but also a resignation to the fact that this is a reality. We're going to have to manage it as best we can. I think the Singapore Prime Minister, Lee Hsien Loong, has often given voice to the fact that it's important for the US to understand and for China to understand that this is an extremely dangerous way to go about things in this region. It's going to once again embroil Southeast Asia as a proxy in a sort of a US-China conflict, as we saw during the Indochina wars, but which were extremely costly in terms of life and suffering.
Yeah, of course.
So I think there's concern, frustration, and an area of resignation because Southeast Asia has no power. As I said earlier, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations doesn't have the centrality that it says it craves. In terms of regional security, the architecture is extremely fractured. Neither China nor the United States really pays any heed to sort of regional forums, not in a meaningful way.
Yeah.
Any attempt by medium and small-sized countries to convene the US and China to talk about this is doomed to failure at this point. So I think that everyone is very frustrated and worried. I think the biggest risk is of a clash in the South China Sea between the US and Chinese navies, where it can be accidental, but there may also be a desire on the part of the high commands in both Beijing and Washington to sort of test one another in terms of military capacity. The sort of idea of let's see what a bloody nose approach would achieve. I think that's a really, really dangerous risk at the moment. There are people, I think, in both capitals who have this sort of sense of, okay, bring it on. And I think on the US side, there is this real worry that if that doesn't happen soon, then the US Navy and military in general may no longer have the capacity to best the Chinese. And on the Chinese side, I think in the current political environment in China, it's possible that in order to lock in his authority, it's possible that it may be tempting for Xi Jinping to go along with some kind of limited confrontation. Although I think that's more on the US side than on the Chinese side. I don't think the Chinese side have much confidence in their ability to manage a conflict well. And there's always the fear of escalation. This could very quickly escalate because at the root of it is this quest for primacy. I mean, the US has woken up at long last to the fact that China essentially has moved ahead in a number of areas where the US is far behind. And that includes in military technology as well, as the latest reports about hypersonic missiles suggest. So I think this puts this region very much in the spotlight and in a very vulnerable position because one part of this region, on the maritime domain, could well be the context in which conflict breaks out.
Yeah. And speaking of the maritime domain, then what are your thoughts on Australia's decision to, pivot from France to go to the highly enriched uranium nuclear powered, underlined, of course, publicly time and time again, submarines? And what is Australia's perhaps role or perceived role or imagined role or otherwise in the region and this kind of bigger geopolitical contestation?
Well, there are two things to say, I think. First of all, is that over the last 20 years, 30 years, Australia's engagement with Southeast Asia has been in a sort of serious decline. And that's largely due to domestic politics to some extent. I mean, I arrived in Indonesia in the late 1980s, mid to late 1980s, where essentially Australia was very firmly engaged on the issue of Cambodian peace process. Its diplomats were extremely active in the region. They played an important role working shoulder to shoulder with regional colleagues on locking in place a peace agreement in 1991 in Cambodia. This was under, obviously, a liberal government. You had, extremely well versed diplomats like Gareth Evans, Michael Costello, Paul Keating with his sort of vision of engagement with the region. That all began to unravel. Labour governments. That all began to unravel, with the sort of the Liberals coming to power in a sort of much more sustained way. And, Australia essentially turning inward, dealing with its own issues, the economy being quite strong on a if you like, a primary commodity basis, meant that there wasn't, what holds Southeast Asia together in many ways economically is its service and retail economy, is the trade, trade in goods, the fact that, there's tourism, there's a lot of movement and there's a lot of commerce. But Australia's economy is not commerce based. It's sort of, iron ore, primary exports. There's not a lot of services that are exported to the region, and I think that's often I think underestimated as an important aspect of why Australia is not so closely bound to Southeast Asia. The second point is, of course, the deep and inherent suspicion of Indonesia, which is the closest neighbor, which is a sort of very deeply felt, almost visceral, sense of fear. A large Muslim nation, right up on our border, with a sort of history of unrest and violence, and not to mention, potential immigration. And so I think that's the sort of second background factor. And then I think thirdly, as I've said before, the US has put enormous pressure on Australia to align itself, even against its better instincts. It started with the positioning of the Marines in Darwin, a lot of pressure to essentially go back to a model that we hadn't seen really since the Second World War of alignment, shoulder to shoulder, as they like to say. And I think these three factors, I think, have contributed to what eventually we saw with AUKUS, which I think is less about submarines and more about a deeper alignment in terms of sharing intelligence, technology. It kind of, whatever people say, Southeast Asia didn't like this. But I mean, for one thing, it's basically, three Anglosphere nations not really sharing very much with the region. Despite, I think Marise Payne has been in the region this week to sort of repair some of the damage, but it just doesn't have a good look, basically. Even to those who argue, and there's this whole kind of tribe of strategic analysts out there who argue that this is so good for the rest of the region because it sort of provides a better security umbrella,
deterrence,
intelligence, deterrence, and so on. But I was struck by people, like Hugh White, Paul Keating, and others who just sounded the alarm on this and sort of said, "Well, wait a minute, is this what we want? Are we going to survive as a semi-continent at the bottom end of the world, being isolated from the region that we're closest to?" And in confrontation with our largest trading partner, is that the way forward, mates? It's like, and yet it doesn't seem to cut much ice domestically, because there is, China hasn't done itself any favors in Australia. It's behaved very aggressively, and used very crude tools that have built up a great deal of public anger and suspicion towards China. So it's a mess. What's the way out? Might be the best way to end this sort of segment, because I think in a way it would be useful for Australia to begin to counterbalance the fallout from AUKUS with. I know, as I said, Marise Payne is going around the region, but more than that, actually seek to deepen relationships that have kind of languished over the last 20 years. I deal very closely with Australian diplomats around the region, and I've always had this incredible respect for Australia's deeper understanding of Southeast Asia and its great sense of perspective on the region, largely driven by a long history of engagement, but also academic focus and so on. And that seems to have deteriorated. And I think it would be useful to see, maybe beginning with civil society, track to university-led discussions about how to restore that sort of rather more sophisticated relationship with the region.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I perpetually seem to try to want to explore in the podcast is this clash between interests versus values, and it strikes me as though Australia is trying to pursue both or merge the both, but oftentimes they clash. Whether it's in the kind of expeditionary wars of the Middle East, support to Iraq, which is now public knowledge in Australia, was a political decision to strengthen our alliance with the US. These kinds of interest-driven decisions that ultimately undermine the values that Australia, in my view at least, and some will chastise me for this, but in my view at least, Australia undermines itself because of there's an overt and obvious clash between pursuing its interests against values that it tries to espouse or promote to the rest of the world. And treatment of France is certainly one of those aspects. I mean, yes, this is not a debate about the actual utility of the submarines, or and I certainly don't want to get into that, but more kind of on the macro level of how we are now perceived by still a world power. What's your view on that? I mean, because how do you see this, or do you see a clash between interests and values?
Well, I think it's true that the two have merged in a way, and AUKUS is a good example of that, because the way the rest of the region views this is that these are three Anglosphere countries, therefore sharing values, who decided that their interests are best served by binding themselves more tightly in terms of those shared values. And, it's less about, it's clear that, of course, France has the biggest deployment in the Pacific, than any other nation other than the United States. So they're very much a Pacific power. It was just a few years ago that Australia was trying to project itself as a Pacific nation. That seems to have gone by the wayside. So I think this binding of interests and values speaks to something much deeper and more important in the world today, which is that the world is because I think the West feels very much threatened by what my friend Gideon Rachman at the FT described in a book a few years ago as Easternization. It's a great term. The fact that the economic focus or locus of activity is shifting eastward, that the center of gravity in the world is no longer in Europe and North America. It's essentially in Asia, or it's shifting towards Asia, not just China, but also India. And Southeast Asia is, almost 700 million souls with vibrant economies. And I think this has injected a sense of insecurity that has forced the West to sort of want to use those common values as more of a binding tool in a kind of last-ditch effort, really, to sort of assert primacy. And it's obviously felt more strongly in the United States because the United States simply cannot conceive of itself. And this is only a relatively recent phenomenon, of course, because pre-1939 or pre-1941, the US was a rather insular country, concerned more about its own neighborhood in the Caribbean and Latin America than Europe and further east. And I think this concern and neurosis about a loss of primacy is driving that sort of values-driven, desire for closer binding and alignment, and binding of those alignments to commitments, which is what we've seen with AUKUS. And it's those commitments that I think we have to worry about, because at the same time in Southeast Asia, there's two concerns. One is this begins to look like old-fashioned sort of white-faced colonialism. And two, there's a question of whether those commitments will ever be lived up to if you don't share the same values. Everyone remembers very clearly what happened in 2012 in Scarborough Shoal. The US did not respond to a Philippines request for help. There's the question of Taiwan as well. So are those values-driven, interest-driven sort of binding commitments the same in Asia? And I think that's an unspoken, very much sort of current question in the minds of many people. And AUKUS didn't help because the optics of the three leaders, the three middle-aged white men on the stage, basically saying we're standing together, and there are no Asians anywhere in sight. That didn't help. And so I think that's the problem. And I also think that the values themselves are becoming more compartmentalized. There's no doubt that the old euphoria of the post-Cold War era, where we're all in a sort of globalized context and we're all doing things together, we're all responsible stakeholders, we're all committed to the multilateral system, that has deteriorated significantly because of domestic politics across Europe and the United States, where domestic constituencies have said, well, actually, we don't subscribe to that agenda. We actually want more for ourselves. We want our children to be better educated and better looked after. Why should we spend money on troops in Afghanistan? Why should we spend money on the multilateral system in the UN when we actually need more ourselves? And that's driving a much more insidious division of the world into different poles of identity and values that are no longer so shared. And I think that's very dangerous.
What do you put that down to? Because that strikes me as, again, something that we'll look back, decades from now, as the unfolding crisis over the last kind of 30, 40 years. Some call it the growing inequality, but, the growth of populism. What do you put that down to? This kind of us versus them, closing off of ourselves. How do you explain it?
Well, I think, to a large extent, the old European concert of powers, the US umbrella, it's going to be hard to maintain. It's costly. People don't want it. And yet, at least for the United States, it's almost unimaginable to think of what they would do without it. They spend what percentage of their GDP on defense? How can you continue to justify that if you're not a purveyor of global peace and values? Peace being a sort of debatable term. And so I think this is the great struggle. How can the West, and I hate to use that term all the time, but we're largely talking about Australia, Europe, and the United States, and North America. How can they begin to adapt to a world in which they are no longer the primary powers? And how can they adjust to the shift in the center of economic and, if you like, political power, global power, to a part of the world which doesn't, and everyone knows this, doesn't completely share those values. I mean, everyone talks about India being in the Quad as a democracy, but if you look at India today, it's far from being a rambunctious, liberal democracy. It's emerging as a sort of, a Hindu nationalist state. So I think that's the great struggle. It's adjustment. It's a struggle of adjustment and accommodation. Hopefully we can achieve this without war. But it's very hard to imagine the United States accepting to go quietly into the night as a sort of lesser power, or Europe to accept that it no longer. I mean, I think Europe's a little bit easier with this. I mean, I go to Europe quite a bit, and I'm always struck by the sense in which they're quite gracefully adjusting to a sort of more mundane existence. Not necessarily wielding power on the global stage. They would rather like to see people respect what Europe has to offer in terms of institutional integrity, in terms of law and values. That's true, but they're less insistent on primacy. And I think that's the great struggle. And here in Asia, it's in Southeast Asia, I think people are torn. On the one hand, there is a sort of liberal segment of society that actually worries very much that if China becomes too primary, or if China's primacy becomes too heavy, then all their struggles for, if you like, openness, transparency, and democracy are going to be lost. And on the other hand, you have elites who never really subscribed to those views in the first place, who basically see an opportunity. And they want to make sure that they're on the right side of that opportunity. But at the same time, they also fear being captured by large Chinese conglomerates. And so I think on all sides, there is a sense of trepidation. I wouldn't say fear, but concern. And they worry about how, if the US in the past, as a major superpower, was hard to manage, how are the Chinese going to be managed? How will they fit in to a global system? Will they adhere to the basic rules of multilateral diplomacy? And I think everyone's watching that. There's a great push in China at the moment to sort of try and get hold of control of governance in certain new areas like artificial intelligence and everyone's worried that, well, when they do that, are they going to adhere to rules, or do they want to make up a new set of rules to benefit themselves? Which, of course, the Chinese would argue is precisely what the West did at the end of the Second World War. They made up rules to benefit themselves, the Bretton Woods system. So we're at this great pivotal moment in a way where we're not quite sure how it's going to go. Is it going to lead to conflict, or is there going to be a grand bargain and accommodation? And what role does this region play in that? Is at a time when 2 years of isolation from one another has made sort of regional diplomacy and advocacy very difficult to conduct. Yeah.
And I suspect that will keep you busy for the foreseeable future. Michael, I'm conscious of the time, so we're coming pretty close to our hard right shoulder. But just a couple of maybe final questions. And this first one relates to, I guess, your DNA as a journalist. Given what we've talked about, it strikes me as a lot of it is to do with, well, you've explicitly said so. It's about maintaining domestic support in the various countries that are involved. And that, of course, is done through the media. What's your view as a journalist who's written for, prominent global newspapers? What are your thoughts on the state of the great fourth estate today?
I sense that the media globally, of course, has suffered a body blow because of the loss of its business. Traditional media suffered a body blow because of the loss of its business model. And it was replaced to some extent by the rise of untrammeled social media. Yeah. And of course, the great fear has always been that if you have untrammeled social media, unconstrained, unmoderated, unedited views and opinions everywhere, the distinction between fact and fiction, and the ability to manipulate, misinformation enormously increases, and that's what's happened. And to some extent, what you see now is people are looking for ways to bridle, to manage social media, and to adhere to a set of behavioral rules, and for people not to exploit and conduct influence operations. But on the other hand, the surest way to better management of information is to have an organized set of media institutions that provide people with, if you like, as a good, moderated, edited content that has been checked for fact, that has been edited so as not to lead people into misunderstanding, that is kind of governed by a set of objective news values. But that's just not happening because there's no money for it. There's no I suppose there's also little demand for it because everyone enjoys being able to have their own say. I sometimes, because of my own background as a journalist in the traditional mold, I sometimes wish that we could return to stronger media bodies or institutions that fostering, well curated content that could then give people a choice, a genuine choice, as to what to believe. And I think this whole idea of being able to impose controls on social media, I think is likely to fail. Because people just want to have their say, and governments, to some extent, want to be able to manipulate information. So I fear that we're not in a good place vis-a-vis the media. What's needed is money to be devoted to provide the resources for reporting and editing. That's how it works. And people need to have trust in the media that they read or see, and that's fast disappearing.
Yeah, and I guess that's been eroded over time, and institutions have failed. So many, particularly, this is one of the reasons for the West, the failed idea of meritocracy and so on. And social media, naturally, by its design, exists as an attention economy to grab your attention. And I discussed this with one of your colleagues, Adam Cooper, in the past on a previous episode. So then, maybe my final question: given everything we talked about, and perhaps the gloomy prognosis that one might want to read between the lines, what makes people like yourself not lose hope? Why have you been able to remain hopeful, maybe, and committed to pursuing mediation, rather than taking a side or stepping outside of the domain, and pursuing perhaps a less noble ideals?
It's a good question, and I think there are two answers. One is, I think I belong to a generation that is optimistic by nature. We, the baby boomer generation, we had a lot of opportunity. We were born and if you like, cast in an era where there was great faith in human endeavor and the institutions created by human endeavor, and so that, I think, leads to an optimistic mindset by nature. And that's not true of, I think, my children's generation. I think they're very much less optimistic about the future, and we haven't even got onto the subject of climate change.
Yeah, that's right.
But I think the second reason is that I think I live and work in a part of the world which is by nature also fairly optimistic. Tomorrow will always be better. There are always opportunities around the corner. People are not so dogmatic. They're rather sort of fearful of ideology. I mean, there's also a great deal of uncertainty and insecurity, but they live with it, and they manage it, I think, rather better. And so, you sort of get up in the morning and you think, well, it's another sunny day. There's not a lot of. It's not like being in the middle of Afghanistan at the moment, or the middle of say, Tigray in Ethiopia. There's not a lot of. There's a bountifulness about this region that I think helps people cope with the problems that they face. And there's also, going back to one of my earlier points, there's a great deal of social elasticity, despite the great inequalities. People have found ways to manage at different levels a sense of community, a sense of belonging, and a great faith in sort of the ability to sort of work through problems. So yes, I mean it's my optimism and also the optimism of this region.
Perhaps that should be a trait adopted by the rest of the world, this idea of flexibility, which I really like. On that note, Michael, it's been fascinating. I feel like we've barely scratched the surface of this exceptionally complex and dynamic area. And of course, it's a likely role that it's playing in geopolitics. But nonetheless, thank you very much for your time. And I look forward to speaking with you again in the future.
Thank you, Maz. It was a great pleasure. Take care. Have a good day.
Thanks for joining us for another episode of The Voices of War. You can access all episodes on www.thevoicesofwar.com or by subscribing wherever you get your favourite podcasts. And while you're there, please give us a review, as we'd love to hear what you think. If you'd like to recommend a guest for the show, you can reach me on info@thevoicesofwar.com.